Sorry, I gotta take this. Listen, I gotta give a talk right now, so yeah, just email me the document and put the video on the Dropbox, and then could you text me a couple of hard-boiled eggs? Thanks, Chris. It's great to be back here. This is such a marvelous event. I hope it lasts forever. One of the chief characteristics of the modern world is its ugliness. The only beauty that we see is in the wrong places, in shallow and ephemeral things like advertising, none of the permanent things. We've noticed that our modern churches are no longer beautiful. Our homes are not beautiful anymore. Our businesses are not. They're only functional. And sometimes they're not even functional. The ugliness gets in the way of the purpose of things. Because one of the purposes of things is to be beautiful. Chesterton says, wherever there are happy men, they will build beautiful things. And the modern world is ugly because we do not love the modern world. He says that men do not produce art in order to become joyful. They are joyful and then they produce art. They don't dance in order to be happy. They dance because they are happy. Art is not the mother of beauty, it is the child of beauty. So I'm advertised today speaking about art, but I'm really going to be talking more about beauty than about art. But I will be talking about art. Like Chris Check, I am a very, very lazy man. But if I were really truly lazy, I would just read you a chapter from this book and have it pass as my talk. Because the title of the chapter in this book, Common Sense 101, is The Signature of Man, which is the title of this talk. If you really want a good exposition of Chesterton on art, get this book and read that chapter. And there's some other good stuff in there as well. That term, the signature of man, comes from Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, of which I don't have a copy of back there. Okay, so if you want to buy it from Eighth Day Books. Best bookstore in the world. But he says that the one thing we know about the caveman, we don't actually know anything about prehistoric man for this great reason is he's prehistoric. We don't know how he actually treated his wife. We don't know what they talked about, what they thought about. We just know one thing. We know only one thing for sure, and that is that he was an artist because he left his art behind. It's still there on the wall. And that's when he says, art is the signature of man. Art is what sets man apart from all the other animals. Camels, even though they have wonderful camel hair brushes, they never paint. Even monkeys have hands, they still don't draw anything. The ants have never built any statues to any of the queen ants. And so art is what sets us apart. And it's because man is made in the image of God. And that makes him distinct from the other creatures because made in the image of God, we are creators. God made a bunch of creators when he created us. We create. And we make art because we love the beautiful, but there's a moral aspect to it as well. We love the good. And good art has a moral quality to it. Chesterton says, art, like morality, starts with drawing the line someplace. He says, art is born when the temporary touches the eternal. The shock of beauty is when the irresistible force hits the immovable post. And he says, the true poet is ultimately dedicated to beauty. He says the minor poets, a dozen minor poets can describe an eternity of hell. But only a few of the eternal poets can describe even 10 minutes of satisfaction. Heaven is the hardest thing to describe. The artist has this ache to produce something beautiful. He's always trying to capture the beautiful, to recreate the beautiful. And in that sense, Chesterton says art is like prayer. It's a work of art is like a prayer. The church, of course, has always understood this, which is why the church has been the patron of the arts, and why the arts have served as a handmaiden of religion. But now, really, the church's purpose has to be to rescue the arts, because they've gotten away. Art has become completely separated from religion. And again, it's because we are creators. That's why we have to rescue art. The province of art, Chesterton says, may be said to discover what are the main lines of our pleasures, to fix them firmly in the mind. It recreates for us the vanished sensation and hunts the flying happiness. All art is a thing of glimpses. And because of all the different forms of art, there's a more appropriate art for one thing than for another. And certain arts do not necessarily translate into other forms of art. In fact, Chris alluded to it in his talk. But Chesterton was already talking about the same thing back in the 1920s. He says there are people who will see movies based on books, and they will be under the impression that they've read the book. And having been involved in trying to create one of Chesterton's novels in a film version that still languishes in post-production blues, we realized how much of the book we had to sacrifice in order to get it onto film. And I've also seen how the latest version of Chesterton's Great Detective, Father Brown on BBC, doesn't look anything like Father Brown on the book. I say it's based on a character with the same name as Father Brown. But some things just simply don't translate into other media. Chesterton says you can't play the Venus de Milo on the trombone. I suppose that the Venus de Milo can't play the trombone either, but that's another matter. Okay, could we have the first slide, please? Could I have the first slide, please? There is no first slide. There are no slides at all. It's really ridiculous for me to talk about art without showing any visuals, but that's what I'm going to do. G.K. Chesterton, the first time he got paid as a writer was to write about art. He wrote some reviews of some art shows at some galleries in London. And those were his very first published writings, were art reviews. Then he reviewed some art books. Interestingly enough, he actually studied to be an artist for a while. He didn't go to Oxford and Cambridge like all of his friends. In fact, his parents were told by the headmaster of St. Paul's School, don't send him to the university. It's impossible to teach him anything. But then he went to art school at the Slade School of Art and also proved there that it was impossible to teach him anything. He ended up dropping out pretty quickly. He was also found in the art school enormous depression because this was the time of the decadent 1890s, and art was admiring decay, like a worm admires a corpse, says Chesterton. And it really did throw him into great depression because he knew that art was supposed to elevate and do something beautiful. But he'd go and spend hours in art galleries. And he writes about the Botticelli nativity scene, slide number 1. And he said, "Do you blame me that I sit for hours before this picture? But if I walked all over the world in the time, I should hardly see anything worth seeing that is not in this picture." That's what art is supposed to do. And he wrote extensively on art. In fact, I have a book back there of his book on G.F. Watts, a marvelous romantic painter who died in about 1904, 1905. Chesterton wrote a book on him. Everyone's forgotten who G.F. Watts is. And there's a wonderful book about him written by Chesterton. And he wrote extensively on art, and I'm not going to talk anything about what he wrote about painting. I want to mention what he said about the two forms of art that he's least associated with: music and dancing. Chesterton had a tin ear, first of all. He admitted he did not understand music, but he said he understood that music is beauty in solution, that it's pure beauty. It's abstract, and yet beauty is a fact. And harmony, he says, is a relation between facts. He said, people talk about the Salvation Army, and they say, we like what the Salvation Army does, but what they represent, but we don't appreciate their methods with the loud bands and the clashing cymbals and everything. And Chesterton's response was, well, no, I actually approve of their methods. It's their message that I disagree with. I mean, he understood that music actually does reach people. It reaches them in a direct way where words do not. But he says pure and absolute beauty is attained by dancing. And I read that, and that just struck me, because you have to understand, I was raised Baptist. And everything all those jokes you hear about Baptists and dancing, they're all true, and then they're not jokes either. We understand dancing is just simply a vertical expression of a horizontal idea. I mean, the main reason that I became Catholic was so I could smoke and drink and play poker. But I still think the Baptists might be right about dancing. And it's hard, of course, to picture G.K. Chesterton dancing. In fact, it's almost impossible to picture that. But this is what he says. He says, Dante makes the very heavens dance in the last pages of the Paradiso, sweeping the sky with swaying and spinning ballets of angels and spirits. The symbol is appropriate. It's appropriate not because dance stands for disorder, but because it stands for order. The dance is, in its nature, a rhythmic and recurrent thing, returning upon itself, and was therefore a perfectly correct and orthodox type of medieval moral theology. Dante's vision of this rhythm and beauty of dance corresponds to his whole conception of life, and it marks the whole difference between medieval life and modern life. There was a break in history between the medieval and the modern age, and before that break, life was conceived as a dance. And after that time, life was conceived as a race. Medieval morality was full of the idea that one thing must balance another, that each stood on one side or the other of something that was in the middle, something that remained in the middle. There might have been any amount of movement, but it was a movement around this central thing, perpetually altering the attitudes, but perpetually preserving the balance. The virtues were like children going round the mulberry bush, only the mulberry bush was that burning bush that is the symbol of the incarnation. Now, since that break in history, the dance has turned into a race. That is, the dancers lose their balance and only recover it by running forward towards some object or alleged object, not an object within their circle or their possession, but an object which they do not yet possess. It's a flying object or a disappearing object, or some hold a disappointing object. One is this rhythmic and recurrent movement because there's a known center, while the other is this precipitate or progressive movement because there's an unknown goal. The latter has produced all of what we call progress. The former produced what the medievals meant by order, the lively order of a dance. The key to beauty, just as the key to dancing, of all art, but most obviously dance, is balance. The dancer is always keeping her balance. As Chesterton says, there's many angles at which one falls. There's only one at which one stands. And he says that beauty is a fine balance. But even more precisely, he says it is the proper proportion. Beauty is precise proportion. All the things worth having, such as health, beauty, happiness, virtue, are all, without exception, things produced by a particular proportion between different things. Beauty in a face depends on the right proportion of eyes and nose and mouth in connection with each other. And they just fit together just right to be beautiful. All these harmonies, these human things that we value, beauty, virtue, and the rest, they do indeed form part of the ultimate purpose of God. Everything in the right place. It's the key to beauty, to health, and to sanity. Chesterton calls proportion the principle of all reality. This distinction between the dance and the race is why Chesterton belongs, he says, to the cult of proportion as opposed to the cult of progress. He says the modern cult of progress really doesn't even make any sense because you can't have progress unless you have a defined goal. And then you know whether or not you're progressing towards it. But we have what we call progressives who haven't defined their goal at all, but they still believe in progress. And he says our notion of progress is simply a going on towards going on. But if you have things in their right proportion, there's no need to progress any further. Chesterton calls it the crisis of perfection. Now, beauty appeals to the sense, it appeals to the emotions, and that's how it gets to the intellect. The failure of modern art, and the failures of modern art are many. They are legion. There's a connection between another story that has that name. The problem is that modern art tries to appeal directly to the intellect by almost insulting the senses. I am going to read one passage from this chapter in this book. One little passage, he says, it's one thing to swallow the new art, it's another thing merely to swallow the new art criticism. Many critics have passed from the proposition that a masterpiece may be unpopular to the proposition that unless it is unpopular, it cannot be a masterpiece. Suppose a man says, "Why am I not free to produce a sublime architectural effect with 37 butter tubs, 3 gas pipes, and a packing case? Why should I not make beauty out of these?" There seems to be no answer except to say, why not indeed? If he will produce sublime architecture out of them, I shall not complain of the sublimity. If he will make beauty from them, I shall not condemn them for contriving to be beautiful. My attitude toward the experiment may be described as one of patient expectancy, of hope not unmingled with doubt. I am waiting for the moment when the pagoda of tubs shall strike my soul like a thunderbolt out of the sky, when I shall stagger with admiration at some perfect poise and balance of pipes and packing cases, which I had never foreseen in my dreams. I say nothing of that inspiring moment of my life, except that it has not come. Now, when we look at modern art, we often have the question, well, what is that supposed to mean? Whereas when we look at timeless, classical, great romantic art, we're struck by the beauty and by this immediate appeal that comes through all our senses at one time. And the meaning almost goes directly to our brains without even passing through our intellect, because the beauty is what first hits us with this wave of meaning, with this sense of wonder. Great art creates a sense of wonder. And Chester says there's actually 2 kinds of wonder that art can create. There's the lower kind and the higher kind. The lower kind is when we wonder at the artist. But the higher kind is when we wonder at all creation. It makes us appreciate everything more. In other words, beauty doesn't appeal to the senses, it appeals through the senses. There's more to beauty than beauty. The true artist, the artist who transcends time, is driven by an ache to find some sense and some story in the beautiful things he sees. He looks at everything with a careful eye and has a hunger for its secrets. He will not let any tower or tree escape him with its tale untold. Every true artist feels that he's touching truths that transcend the here and now, that his images are shadows of things seen through the veil. He knows that there's something there, something behind the clouds or within the trees. He believes that the pursuit of beauty is the way to find it, that imagination is a sort of incantation that can call it up. But a man cannot have the energy to produce good art without having the energy to wish to pass beyond it. A small artist is content with art. A great artist is content with nothing except everything. Chesterton, when he went to art school in the 1890s, it was at the height of the philosophy of Oscar Wilde, who said we should pursue art for art's sake. Chesterton knew that this was a fallacy. And he said, just because fallacies are fashionable, they don't cease to be fallacies. He says, you never work so well for art's sake as when you are working for something else. In the case of too much of modern art, there's this immediate, it doesn't have an immediate appeal to beauty, it doesn't have a timeless quality, and so that's why we rely on the art critic to tell us what it is that we're looking at. This understanding that beauty works through our senses is something else, of course, that the Catholic Church has always understood. In our worship, we need to see beauty, we need to hear it, we need to smell it and touch it and taste it. All the things that happen at Mass. It's incarnational. It is sacramental. And it's also about balance and perfect proportion. This may not be evident at times, and it's sometimes not even evident when we look at the church. But it is evident when we look everywhere else. The balance and the proportion of the church is most evident when we compare it to all the heresies that spin out of the church. Every heresy is a virtue that has gone wild, a virtue that is out of balance with the other virtues. There's a Chesterton line that I quote every day. It comes up every day for some reason. It's coming up right now. He says that when you have a broken society, as our society broke up at the Reformation, two things happen. The vices run wild and they do great damage. But the virtues also run wild, and the virtues do even greater damage, because the virtues become isolated from one another and are wandering alone, and then the virtues start doing war with each other. Thus you'll have people who care only about truth, and other people who care only about pity. But the people who care only about truth, their truth is pitiless. And the people who care only about pity, their pity is untruthful. We're watching that war going on in our society. We're watching it going on in our church right now. The virtues are out of proportion with each other. Every heresy is a truth taught out of proportion. Heretics like Chesterton at first when they read him, because he utters a truth that they understand, that they recognize. They stop like him when they discover he's uttering truths that they don't recognize. He's a complete thinker. He has everything in its place and in its proper proportion. He argues that Christianity did what paganism could not do. It reconciles the two lobes of the brain, the one that dreams and the one that calculates, the one that loves and the one that laughs. And Chesterton's one of the few writers who actually does the same thing, who combines imagination with reason, with what is very solemn, with what is very funny. Chesterton says the opposite of funny is not serious. The opposite of funny is not funny. And we expect a good religion to bring us to our knees. That's what a good religion should do. But he says the real test of a good religion is if we could laugh at it. Does Islam meet the test? Can we make jokes about the Catholic Church? Yes. Yes, we can. And we can enjoy it. We have enough intellectual detachment to be able to laugh about these things. At the same time, we have a compassionate attachment to take the things very seriously. This sense of proportion is also applied to property. Chesterton argues everyone should have property. It is proper that they have property, but they should not have a disproportionate amount of property. Property is about what is proper. Property is also about creativity. It enhances our natural creativity as natural artists. It's the idea that everyone should be entitled to their own raw material so they can carve it into something that they choose to make. And he also says that most people are poets. It's only the minority that are critics of poetry. Now, what are the objections to the things that I've just said? There's quite a few. I'll help you with a few of them. What about the objection that beauty is just a matter of taste and that there's no disputing about matters of taste? Well, that objection somehow means that someone is willing to dispute about taste, because someone has already disputed about it, which is why you say, well, there's no disputing about taste, but you're saying that to someone who's disputing about taste. In other words, there is a dispute about taste. You can argue about these things, and you should argue. A good argument is a good argument. But there are different personal preferences, personal likes and dislikes that simply are personal, and there's no convincing or arguing that will ever change those small preferences. I know that Chris Check and I are not going to agree on certain popular bands. But those things don't matter. That's what's great about those disputes. They don't matter. They're really about minor things. They're really about the glory of the variety that God has made. And we can't let this argument apply to the greater things like truth itself, because truth is not subjective. There is an objective truth that exists, whether we like it or not, and lots of times we don't like it because it makes us change our lives. It calls us to make sacrifices. It might even call us to die. But this argument that beauty is only a matter of taste, the answer, says Chesterton, is that beauty is a matter of proportion. And when something's out of proportion, we recognize that it's not beautiful. Beauty itself, he says, is unanswerable. Ugliness is what gets argued about. We really argue about what's ugly. Now, what about the objection that beauty is vain? The idea that vanity is simply empty and fleeting and futile. Well, this might be true of beauty for beauty's sake, but I think it refers to what Chris Check said when he was quoting St. Augustine, the lust of the eyes. That even something as beautiful as beauty can be misused. It can be out of proportion if something becomes too sensuous, too lush, too surfacey. It fails in the crisis of perfection. But it's not that beauty itself is vain. But yet, Chester would also argue that vanity, there's a difference between vanity and pride. There's certainly vanity in the sense of emptiness, but vanity in the sense of wanting to be praised is a natural thing. We all want to be praised. We all want to be praised for something we've done well. God wants to be praised. But pride enters when we start praising ourselves. Being praised is something we have to allow other people to do for us and not do ourselves. Chester says vanity is thinking that praise is important. Pride is thinking yourself more important than praise. Now, this distinction between vanity and pride is best illustrated by Thomas of Becket, who Chesterton points out wore his beautiful bishop's robes because that's what the people wanted and expected from the Bishop of Canterbury, but underneath he wore a hair shirt so that he could remain humble. The other thing about beauty is that it's passionate, but it's also compassionate. It's sympathetic. It connects to an audience. It feels the passion of others. And that's where the spiritual works of mercy and the physical works of mercy come in, because we're taught to help the poor, to feed the hungry, to heal the sick, clothe the naked, to visit the prisoner. We're taught to see Christ in the poor and also see Christ in the Eucharist. That's a sympathetic understanding of beauty. The saints live romantic lives. And Chester says inside the word romantic is the word Rome. And they live passionate lives. Chester calls St. Francis of Assisi a poet whose whole life was a poem. They live truly beautiful lives because they understand perfect proportion. They understand that the big things have to be big and the small things have to be small. And that's where we need to think right now in our own lives. What is beautiful in your life? What is not beautiful? What is out of proportion? Are the big things big enough? And are the small things small enough? The big things are God, the church, your vocation, the thing that God has made you to do, to serve his kingdom, the way that you are the hand of God in others' lives. Whether it's the priesthood or the religious life, or whether it's the job that God has made you to do. Certainly your marriage, your spouse, your family, those are the big things. The small things, money, food, sports, cars, computers. Justice is a big thing. Politics are a small thing. Think of all the things in your life. Figure out which list those things are on. Think of which list they're on right now and which list they should be on. There's nothing wrong with the small things. We should be thankful for them. Thanks, says Chesterton, is the highest form of thought. But make sure you have things on the right list, the right proportion of the small things and the big things. One of the biggest things in the world is one of the smallest things in the world. Chesterton says, babies are the most beautiful things on earth. So finally, I will, and there is a finally, the most beautiful words in any talk. I'll give you a finally, and it's not from Chesterton. It's from a lesser writer named St. Paul. He gave us a finally. He said, finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. God bless.
Jesus.